Your surname may be carrying a story your family stopped remembering centuries ago. Not a story written in a diary or preserved in a family Bible, but one hidden inside the name and every day. Nearly 1,000 years ago, men crossed the Channel into England carrying weapons, horses, ambitions and loyalties. Some also carried names connected to villages in Normandy, estates in northern France, fathers, occupations and powerful households. Generations passed, French-speaking families became English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish, spellings shifted. Social boundaries blurred, yet fragments of those medieval identities survived. The question is whether your surname is one of them, but there is a catch. Finding your surname among the names in this story does not automatically make your ancestors Norman, and by the end you will understand exactly why. Because one of the most ordinary-looking British surnames we will reach began in a form that looked very different indeed. To understand the trail, we need to correct one tempting idea immediately. There were not 30 neat modern hereditary surnames waiting on the Sussex coast on the morning of the Battle of Hastings. Surnames were still developing, and many names that later became hereditary emerged or stabilized across subsequent generations. What 1066 dramatically changed was the environment in which those names developed. England's ruling elite was transformed. Continental families acquired estates, offices and influence, while French-speaking aristocratic culture became deeply embedded in the kingdom. So when we say a surname survived 1066, we are not imagining somebody called Mr. Warren or Mrs. Neville stepping from William's ships with a modern family name already fixed forever. We are following names whose histories lead into the Norman and Anglo-Norman world created by the conquest. Before we follow them, put your surname in the comments and tell me where your family comes from. And if British family history is your kind of mystery, subscribe to UK Bloodlines, because even if your name appears in the next few minutes, you may discover that finding it is only the beginning. Now imagine England in October 1066, ships have crossed grey water. Horses are being led onto unfamiliar ground, armour is wet with rain and mud. On a ridge near Hastings, exhausted English troops face an army commanded by William, Duke of Normandy. The battle that follows will become one of the most famous in British history. But for our investigation, the crucial question is not simply how William won. It is what happened afterwards. A crown had been taken, but a kingdom still had to be controlled. Castles rose over unfamiliar landscapes, estates changed hands. New monasteries and churches appeared. Continental families entered English aristocratic networks. Somewhere, an English landholder who had known one lord could now look across his fields and see the household of another. The conquest did not replace England's population, but it profoundly altered its upper ranks, its landholding and the linguistic world surrounding power. And in that changing landscape, names began leaving trails. One of the clearest is Beaumont. The name is unmistakably French in appearance, formed from elements associated with a beautiful or fine hill, and several French places carried versions of it. Anglo-Norman Beaumont families became extraordinarily prominent after the conquest. But the important clue is not simply that Beaumont sounds French. Originally, names like this could identify people through geography. A place became an identifier became associated with a family, and eventually descendants could inherit the label long after the original location had disappeared from everyday memory. The same mechanism sits behind Montgomery. Roger de Montgomery became one of the most powerful magnates of early Norman England, while the name itself belongs to the geography of Normandy. Yet Montgomery would eventually sound completely at home in British history, particularly in the borderlands and Scotland. That transformation raises our first larger mystery. How does a name arrive as a marker of continental geography and end up sounding native to the country that adopted it? With Mortimer, the trail crosses the Channel again. The medieval de Mortimer family was associated with Mortimer in Normandy before becoming one of the great dynasties of medieval England and the Welsh Marches. Their later political power makes it tempting to see Mortimer as the label of one enormous aristocratic bloodline stretching untouched into the present. But that is exactly the assumption we need to resist. A famous medieval family can explain why a surname became historically important without proving that every modern bearer descends biologically from that house. Then there is Mowbray, whose modern spelling almost disguises its continental beginning. Earlier forms connect the name to Montbray in Normandy. Robert de Mowbray became Earl of Northumbria in the late 11th century, before rebellion cost him his position. Already, barely a generation after Hastings, we can see how quickly Norman-associated families became entangled in specifically English regional politics. A name could begin in France, acquire power in northern England, and then pass through generations of scribes until it looked as though it had always belonged there. Picture one of those scribes centuries before spelling became standardized. A man speaks his name across a wooden table. The clerk bends over parchment, dips his quill, and writes what he thinks he has heard. There is no passport to copy from, no central database to correct him. French pronunciation meets English ears. Latin documents reshape spoken words. Regional accents interfere. One generation's spelling becomes another generation's variation. The name survives, but its surface changes. Have you recognized your own name yet? If you have, hold that thought. The twist is coming, because recognizing the surname is not the same thing as recognizing your ancestry. Consider Darcy, historically found in forms such as Darcy or D'Arcy. Anglo-Norman families carrying the name became established in England and later Ireland. That small D originally indicated association with a place. It was not an eternal certificate of nobility, and it could disappear as names evolved. Lacy, similarly associated with the medieval de Lacy families, became deeply important in both England and Ireland. By the time generations had been born, married and buried in the British Isles, what exactly was still foreign about such families? Their names had travelled, but their identities were changing around them. A stranger survival is Bigod. Roger Bigod was an important Norman landholder in post-conquest England and founded a dynasty that later produced Earls of Norfolk. Unlike Beaumont or Montgomery, Bigod does not immediately advertise a French geographical beginning to the modern ear, and that makes it useful. If you search only for surnames that still look obviously French, you may misunderstand how thoroughly medieval names could be reshaped by Britain. The story becomes wider with Bruce. In medieval records, the Scottish royal surname appears in forms such as de Bruce. The family entered British history through the Anglo-Norman aristocratic world before one branch became inseparable from Scotland and, eventually, Robert the Bruce. By then, describing Bruce as simply foreign would tell us very little. Medieval families migrated, married, acquired lands, and changed loyalties. Names travelled with them. Sinclair offers another striking transformation. Its medieval forms, including St. Clair and Clair, point towards a continental place name tradition. Yet Sinclair eventually became one of the surnames most strongly associated in popular imagination with Scotland. This is where the idea of a fixed Norman identity starts breaking down. A family could preserve a name associated with continental origins while becoming culturally, politically, and genealogically embedded somewhere entirely different. And some names almost preserve a medieval map. Mandeville, historically de Mandeville, belonged to a major Anglo-Norman family whose fortunes became entangled with royal politics. Vaux, appearing in medieval forms such as de Vaux, likewise belongs to the French-speaking aristocratic world. Sackville has been connected with a Norman place name, while Baskerville also carries a geographical trail associated with Normandy. For very different modern surnames, yet behind them sits the same basic human need, to distinguish one person from another by answering a question as simple as, where did he come from? Now imagine the answer becoming meaningless to the people who inherit it. A man's grandfather was identified by an estate across the Channel. His father grew up in England. He himself has never seen Normandy. His children know the name, but not the village. A geographical description has become a family possession, and centuries later, a descendant may carry that same label without knowing it was ever a place at all. That is the transformation behind Ferrers, associated with the prominent de Ferrers family and Ferriers in Normandy. The family established substantial power in England after the conquest. Courtenay followed a different continental trail before becoming deeply associated with southwest England, especially Devon. Harcourt, too, leads towards a Norman place name and a family whose English history would stretch across centuries. At this point the pattern is becoming clearer, but one of the most important surprises is that not every Norman-associated surname came from a place. With Gifford, the mechanism shifts. Walter Gifford was a major Norman figure in conquered England, and bearers of the name appear early in the Anglo-Norman world. Its linguistic story reminds us that Norman naming was never a single machine producing identical labels. Some names came from places, others from personal characteristics, fathers, nicknames, offices, or occupations. And the next few names begin to reveal how deeply the French-speaking world of medieval power entered everyday English vocabulary. Talbot became attached to a major Anglo-Norman lineage, and later one of medieval England's great aristocratic families, but its deeper linguistic history appears to belong to an old French personal or nickname tradition, rather than simply an estate. Russell makes the point even more clearly. Its Norman French background is associated with Roussel, referring to reddish colouring, and used as a nickname or personal designation. A description of somebody's appearance could therefore outlive the person, become attached to descendants, and eventually turn into an inherited surname. But now we reach the problem with this entire investigation. A Norman surname does not necessarily mean Norman ancestry. A surname usually represents only one narrow pathway through an enormous family tree. Names can change spelling. They can be adopted. Different families can develop the same surname independently. Unrelated lines can converge on identical modern forms. A child can inherit a surname through social or legal relationships that do not preserve a simple biological paternal chain. A famous family can make a name historically visible, while thousands of later bearers have entirely different genealogical stories. To people called Russell today could therefore carry the same surname and have completely different roots into it. How many names have you recognized so far? Tell me your surname below. And if you have managed to trace your family beyond the 1700s, tell us the earliest place the records have taken you. Because from this point onward, the real question is no longer whether a name sounds Norman. It is what evidence could connect your particular family to that history. The Domesday Book are the perfect place to understand both the possibilities and the limits. Ordered by William and compiled from the Great Survey, completed in 1086, Domesday records land, resources, values, and many of the people connected with landholding. It reveals how dramatically ownership had changed after the conquest and provides extraordinary evidence for the presence of a new elite. That Domesday is not a giant directory of modern British surnames. It does not allow a 21st century person to find a familiar-looking name and leap across 9 centuries of missing generations. A medieval landholder with a similar name is historical evidence. He is not automatically your ancestor. And there is another route by which Norman influence entered surnames. Work. Butler developed from Norman French terminology connected with an officer responsible for wine or drink in an important household. In Ireland, the name became famously associated with descendants of Theobald Walter and the office of chief butler. But an occupation could produce surnames in more than one family, so the existence of a powerful butler dynasty does not make every modern butler part of it. Spencer belongs to the same world of household administration, associated with the dispenser or official responsible for provisions. Centuries later, it would sound thoroughly English and become attached to one of Britain's most recognizable aristocratic families, even though the linguistic environment behind the occupational term belongs to the world shaped by Norman French. Marshall and Chambers show how quickly the mechanism could spread beyond a single household. Marshall developed from terminology connected with horses and later an important household or military office. Chambers is associated with the chamber and those serving around it. The famous William Marshall may dominate the historical imagination, but an occupational surname does not automatically make every bearer his descendant. Picture the whole instead: horses stamping outside in the cold, barrels being carried towards storage, provisions counted, servants moving through the chamber, an official calling instructions across the noise. Nobody there is trying to invent surnames for people living 900 years later. They are simply distinguishing one Robert from another. Yet an office, repeated often enough beside a personal name, can become attached to a household, then to children, then to grandchildren. Everyday administration becomes genealogy, and that reveals something larger. About 1066, the surname legacy of the Normans is not limited to descendants of knights who physically fought at Hastings. Norman French became deeply influential in the language of court, law, lordship, and administration. Words cross linguistic boundaries. Offices became family identities. A surname can therefore preserve part of the Norman cultural transformation of England without proving that its bearer descends from one of William's soldiers. Now look at Devereux. Medieval forms of the name are associated with Evro, and it became established among Anglo-Norman families in Britain and Ireland. Its modern pronunciation and spelling can conceal how obvious the geographical association once was. And this is another clue worth remembering. If your surname does not look French today, That tells you surprisingly little about what it looked or sounded like 7 or 8 centuries ago. Clifford turns the mystery around completely, because the place behind the surname is English rather than Norman. The great medieval Clifford family acquired its name through association with Clifford in Herefordshire. That corrects another easy misconception. Norman-associated surnames were not all imported from Normandy ready-made. Incoming families could acquire English estates and eventually take names from those places. The conquest created surname histories not only by moving names into England, but by changing the people who controlled the landscapes from which new names could emerge. And the story did not stop at England's borders. A name could begin in Normandy, become Anglo-Norman, and within generations be woven into Welsh, Irish or Scottish history. Marcher lordships carried families into the Welsh borderlands. Anglo-Norman expansion carried others into Ireland. Aristocratic migration and marriage brought continental and Anglo-Norman families into Scotland. Bruce could become unmistakably Scottish. Fitzgerald could become inseparable from Ireland. The surname might preserve an old route across the Channel even when the family identity at the other end had become something entirely new, which brings us to the 5 names that expose the Norman surname mystery most clearly. And the first begins with perhaps the most misunderstood clue of all. Fitz came through Anglo-Norman French from a word meaning son. Originally it was patronymic. It identified someone through his father. It was not a magical aristocratic stamp. A Fitz name can preserve an Anglo-Norman naming tradition. But Fitz by itself does not prove noble blood, does not prove that an ancestor fought at Hastings, and certainly does not mean that every bearer belongs to one medieval dynasty. Consider FitzAlan. At its simplest, the construction means son of Alan. The famous medieval FitzAlan line rose within the Anglo-Norman aristocratic world and would eventually become closely associated with the earldom of Arundel. Here we can almost watch a naming formula harden into a dynasty. A son is identified through his father. The identification persists, generations inherit it. Eventually what began as a description becomes a hereditary surname. But even here, the linguistic meaning tells us how the name was formed, not which Alan belongs in the family tree of every modern FitzAlan. Then comes Fitzgerald, and suddenly the Norman trail leaves England behind. The construction means son of Gerald, while the Geraldines became enormously influential after the Anglo-Norman intervention in Ireland, producing the powerful Kildare and Desmond branches. Yet something remarkable happened over the generations. Families of Anglo-Norman origin became deeply embedded in Ireland, interacting and intermarrying with the society around them. Some adopted Gaelic customs and cultural identities. A name could retain an Anglo-Norman linguistic structure, while the people carrying it became part of an unmistakably Irish story. That is why asking whether a surname is Norman can eventually become the wrong question. A better question is, what happened to the family after the name began? And DNA cannot simply solve that problem for us. A commercial ethnicity estimate cannot identify a neat percentage labeled Norman, 1066. The Normans themselves were a historically formed population, descended from Scandinavian settlers and people already living in the region that became Normandy, and their descendants mixed extensively with populations elsewhere. Y chromosome testing can sometimes help investigate whether male bearers of a surname share paternal ancestry, particularly where a name remains strongly patrilineal. But even if the men share a paternal genetic connection, DNA alone cannot tell us that their common ancestor was a Norman knight. Genetics can support a genealogical investigation. It cannot replace one. So what would stronger evidence actually look like? Start with the surname's etymology, but do not stop there. Trace your documented family backwards through civil certificates, parish registers, wills, tax records, property documents, manorial material, and whatever survives for your branch. Follow geography as carefully as spelling. Does the family remain concentrated in one region for generations? Do earlier spellings begin moving towards a medieval form? Can one documented generation actually be connected to the one before it? Medieval records matter only when the chain leading towards them can be responsibly constructed. The surname gives you a hypothesis. Documentary genealogy tests it. Geography provides context. DNA, where appropriate, may add supporting evidence. And that brings us to Neville. Few names are more deeply embedded in medieval English political history, yet its origin points back towards Neuville, essentially new town or a new settlement, a place name found in Normandy and elsewhere in France. By the 15th century, the Nevilles were no foreign curiosity. They stood at the centre of English power. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the figure remembered as the Kingmaker, became one of the defining personalities of the Wars of the Roses. A name rooted in continental geography had become attached to one of England's most formidable dynasties. Yet a modern Neville still cannot jump from surname to Kingmaker without building the generations between. The next name became even more inseparable from a particular part of England. Percy feels almost native to the north. For centuries the Percy family became associated with Northumberland, the borderlands and Alnwick. Their history is full of castles, rebellions, rivalries and negotiations with the English crown. Yet the early trail points back across the Channel. William de Percy, an early Norman landholder, carried a name associated with places called Percy in Normandy and appears within the new landholding world recorded after the conquest. A geographical label from northern France eventually became one of the names most strongly associated with northern England. Imagine one of his distant descendants standing beneath an English castle wall generations later. Normandy may now be little more than a story about ancestors. His land is English. His marriage is English. His disputes are English. His children may never cross the Channel. Perhaps they cannot even identify the village from which the name once came. At what moment did the family stop being Norman and become English? There is no clean answer. Identity changed gradually, while the surname remained. And there is still one final name, because it answers the question we planted at the beginning better than almost any other: Warren. Today it looks completely natural in the English-speaking world. There is no obvious no immediate French appearance. Nothing about Warren necessarily makes a modern viewer imagine a Norman estate or a family crossing the Channel in the 11th century. But behind important historical Warren lines stands a very different-looking form, de Warenne. William de Warenne was one of the major magnates of Norman England and became one of the kingdom's greatest landholders in the generations following the conquest. His name belonged unmistakably to the aristocratic world created by Norman victory. But language does not stand still. The de could disappear. Pronunciation could change. Scribes could render forms differently. Warren could move towards Warren until the continental-looking medieval name became an ordinary modern British surname. De Warenne. Warren. Almost 1,000 years of linguistic and social change compressed into a few altered letters. The transformation of de Warenne into Warren demonstrates what surnames can preserve. It does not tell every Warren who their ancestors were. And yet even here, at the strongest reveal in our investigation, we must resist the easiest conclusion. If your surname is Warren, you have discovered a fascinating possibility, not proof that William de Warenne is your ancestor. Another Warren family may have acquired the surname through a different route. Two people carrying the same modern spelling can have genealogies that separate centuries before surviving records can connect them. That is the real lesson hidden inside all 30 names. A surname can survive while almost everything around it changes. It can outlive the language that formed it, the estate that inspired it, the social office that created it, and the political world that made its first bearers important. It can cross borders and become English, Welsh, Scottish or Irish. It can lose letters, prefixes and meanings. It can survive wars, migrations, marriages and generations in which nobody remembers why the family was called that in the first place. Imagine one last time a man arriving in England in the generations around the conquest. He cannot know what England will become. He cannot know how French and English cultures will blend, how descendants might move north or west, how clerks will reshape the spelling of his name, how estates will be inherited and lost, or how family stories will disappear. He certainly cannot imagine someone nearly a millennium later opening a digital archive, seeing that same name on a screen and wondering whether there is a path between them. And perhaps there is, but history deserves something stronger than a matching surname. If your name appeared in this investigation, comment with the surname and the earliest place and date you have genuinely traced your family to. And subscribe to UK Bloodlines, because every surname has a history, but finding where your own branch actually begins is where the real story starts. A surname is the clue. Your family tree is the investigation. Somewhere behind the spelling you carry today may be a village, an estate, an occupation, a forgotten father, a medieval clerk, or a family that crossed the sea and slowly became part of another country. Your surname may be nearly 1,000 years old. The question is whether you can follow it home.